If you owe the bank $100, that's your problem. But if you owe the bank $100 million, that's the bank's problem. You have power over the bank, and then you can renegotiate the terms of that relationship. Corporations do it all the time. Extraordinarily wealthy people do it all the time. How can household debtors do the same? Debtors, isolated, we are vulnerable, we are marginalized, but together we can leverage a tremendous amount of power. Think of that $1.8 trillion of outstanding student debt. Together, we own the bank.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, economic anthropologist and founder of the Debt Collective, Professor Hannah Appel. And in a moment, we're going to be talking to her about the growing movement for debt abolition and where MMT fits in with it. Even though cancelling student debt is a popular idea across the political spectrum, for those in opposition, maybe part of the resistance to it is the idea that money is a scarce resource that shouldn't be gambled on questionable things like healthcare or education. Rather, it should be allocated wisely to organisations with a proven track record, like, say, Enron or General Motors or Trump Entertainment Resorts Incorporated. Or maybe there's a concern that when debts are written off, ultimately the government foots the bill. And because we fund the government with our taxes, it'll come out of our pockets or the pockets of future generations. But that's not how money as we know it today works. How does it work? Well, it's pretty clear that money is constructed. And so the question is, constructed by who or what? You could test the claim that money originates in the private sector by printing your own banknotes and seeing how widely they get accepted, or alternatively, you could consider why private firms come to the government for a bailout rather than the other way around. It's because the money in your pocket, if it's not counterfeit, came from the government. The government keystrokes its money into existence by changing numbers on a spreadsheet at a central bank, and it also sets the conditions under which money can be lent into existence by its designated agents, such as commercial lenders. And you can check out our episode 126 for more details on that. So if the government issues its own spending money, what are they doing with our tax revenue? Well, part of the answer is in the word revenue, which derives from an old French word meaning return. And in this case, their words, just like their kissing, their fries, and their work-life balance, are bang on the money. The government needs to be able to spend its money to hire people and buy things to implement the policies it was voted into office to carry out. And to ensure the acceptability of its money, it issues tax liabilities or tax bills denominated in its unit of account, which means people need to earn the government's money rather than artisanal home-crafted money in order to pay those tax bills. This allows the government to spend its money into existence to hire people, and then only after that do we in the private sector have the money to return to the government via tax payments. So in short, the government uses taxation to get you to need its money. And you can listen to our episode 20 for more on how that works. Understanding how governments spend and why they tax isn't the answer to everything, but starting with reality is probably the best way to begin to answer the urgent questions facing us today, such as what is Matt Damon doing with his life right now? Or on a lighter note, do we want an economy where people have to take on a mountain of debt to afford medicine or education, or too often just food and shelter? And what can we do if we're led by politicians who seem to be just fine with all of that? In a moment, we're going to be talking about how this situation can be remedied literally with the stroke of a pen, the debt situation, not the Matt Damon situation, and also about debt strikes and the very real victories organised by the Debt Collective. two quick announcements before we dive in. The first one is that the Levy Economics Institute of Bard College in New York is running a summer seminar from June the 11th to the 18th, and nearly all of the sessions can be attended online free of charge. And secondly, just a reminder that applications are still open for people who want to take part in the Edward Lipinski Foundation's MMT Summer School in Poznan, Poland, which I highly recommend as someone who went last year. That runs from the 10th to the 14th of August, and applications are open until the 8th of July. I've linked to where you need to go to benefit from either or both of these great opportunities in the show notes, where, as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month, or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pina.
And we're honored to be joined today by economic anthropologist and co-founder of the Debt Collective, Professor Hannah Appel. Thanks for joining us today, Hannah.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
So, Hannah, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be doing the kind of work you're doing around debt cancellation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you said, my academic background is in anthropology, and I specialized in anthropology. And there in my PhD, I was really interested in this question of what can anthropological ways of knowing tell us about capitalism that maybe we didn't already know. But shortly after I finished my PhD, I moved to New York, and it just so happened to coincide with the rise of Occupy Wall Street, and a fellow anthropologist and one of my dear friends, David Graeber, was there, and he brought a bunch of us down to Occupy Wall Street, and many of us, including me, never left. So it was really my involvement in Occupy Wall Street, coming on the heels of a PhD in economic anthropology, that kind of set me on this path to thinking about debtors' unions and to pursue a life that is equal parts academia and organizing.
Can you remember how and when you first encountered modern monetary theory?
Of course I can. So one of the groups I participated in Occupy Wall Street was called the Alternative Banking Working Group of Occupy Wall Street. The Alternative Banking Working Group actually still meets to this day. So over a decade, over the parks of Occupy Wall Street were cleared. And we met at that time in the economics department of Columbia University. A wonderful comrade, Professor Suresh Naidu, who is a professor of economics in Columbia, gave us the keys to the kingdom. And so we met on Sundays in the econ department. And there were several people, including Nathan Tankis, including Raul Carrillo, who participated in the Alternative Banking Working Group of Occupy Wall Street and were really the first to introduce me to modern monetary theory.
So, Hannah, tell us about the Rolling Jubilee project and how it evolved into the Debt Collective.
The Rolling Jubilee project is a kind of hack of existing debt infrastructures. So what the Rolling Jubilee project does is the Debt Collective, or the Rolling Jubilee kind of legal entity, is we are in fact certified as a debt collector, right? So we jumped through the legal hoops, we jumped through the regulatory hoops to get certified as a debt collector. And why did we do this? Because some forms of household debt, medical debt, private probation debt, a very, very small privately held portion of student loan debt, circulate on these secondary markets, which is to say it's no longer the hospital trying to collect your medical bill, or it's no longer the probation department in your local county trying to collect your probation bill, or it's no longer the school you went to trying to collect your private tuition receivables. Rather, those debts have been sold off to debt collectors on secondary markets. And they're sold for pennies on the dollar. So the hospital gets an enormous tax write-off to sell those debts so they don't lose any money. And then the debt collector, let's say the debt collector bought a bill for $1,000, the right to collect an $1,000 bill from you, the medical debtor, but they only bought it for $2 or $3. So you can see already the profit margin that the debt collectors stand to make is extraordinary. So we went through the hoops to become certified as a debt collector. And then in the beginning of the Rolling Jubilee project, we crowdsourced a bunch of money, small dollar donations, to buy mostly medical debt on the secondary market and abolish it. And this is an exciting tactic in many ways. It kind of shows that debt circulates so far beyond what we're taught, right? Debt is not a moral relationship between a debtor and a creditor, and the creditor is so generous, and therefore the debtor is morally obligated to pay them back, right? First of all, nobody should go into kind of exorbitant debt because they need to access the basic things in life like medical care. But it also shows that debt, for the people who know how to use it, is a form of extraordinary profit, right? Like for those debt collectors. But household debtors ourselves, folks who hold medical debt, student debt, carceral debt, have never been able to leverage debt in that way. So that was kind of one of the tactics that we used to start almost like a political education about how debt actually works. And of course, abolishing the debts of hundreds of thousands of people in the meantime. Now, the Rolling Jubilee as a tactic was picked up by everybody from talk show host John Oliver to a kind of offshoot group called RIP Medical Debt, in part, and this is the problem with it, because it can be depoliticized. It can kind of seem like just a magic trick, right? That, everybody's debt can just be purchased away on the secondary market. That was never our intention. Our intention was always to use it to start building this provocation that we had dreamed of, which is a debtors union. And indeed, one of the few times that we bought private student loan debts, we bought the tuition receivables of some folks who had attended the Corinthian colleges, which at the time was the largest for-profit college chain in the United States. And through buying and abolishing their tuition receivables, we got in touch with a bunch of students who were actually, or former students, student debtors, who are already organizing against their predatory for-profit schools. So it was one of the Rolling Jubilee debt portfolio purchases that led us to some of the original Corinthian students with whom we organized.
One of the things I like about modern money theory is it tells us what money actually is. It's a promise or it's an obligation. Those are both other words for debt, but it's a liability of one party, which in the hands of another party is an asset. So for instance, a commercial bank balance is a liability to that commercial bank, but it's an asset to the commercial bank customer. And if you're that customer, when you take out a loan, the lender, the bank, is creating credit money, which is the bank's liability and your asset. But at the same time, your promise to pay the bank in the future could be thought of as money. That contract could be thought of as a banknote from the bank of you. And it seems to me the debt collective are cognizant of how debt is really just a mirror image of credit. And have said, okay, what can we do with these financial assets that people create and issue to lenders when they borrow these banknotes from the various banks of you? How can we leverage them?
Absolutely. And in fact, I think that one of the things that has really drawn me to modern monetary theory, you say, one of the benefits of what we learn from MMT is that we learn what money really is, and it is an obligation, it is a relationship, it is a promise. That is a profoundly anthropological insight, right? If you look at the anthropology of money for the last century, you see very similar framings. And I think why I'm drawn to MMT is it's kind of what I would call, it's based on ethnographic empiricism, right? So when you hear Professor Stephanie Kelton speak, she says, when I was the congressional budget officer, and I watched the way that the federal government was making money change hands in practice, when I watched the way that they simply credited the bank account of the Pentagon, right? The way the Federal Reserve simply credits the bank account of the Pentagon. Professor Kelton is making an argument from an anthropological perspective that I would call a kind of ethnographic empiricism, right? You're saying this is the way it actually works on the ground. This is not the way that textbooks taught us that it works, but this is the way I can actually say I was a participant in it and I can narrate to you how it actually works. And I think you're absolutely right that the debt collective's idea of a debtors union leverages this understanding of money. And here's one thing I would say that I think is interesting about that. I think even though, most conventional economics textbooks, certainly most extraordinarily wealthy corporate owners, corporate shareholders, most of them don't kind of fully buy into the MMT understanding of the fiscal and monetary world. Wealthy people and corporations actually know perfectly well how debt works, which is to say they are always the ones who are able to get their paycheck protection loans abolished, right? They are always the ones able to use debt collectively as leverage. And often at the Debt Collective, we quote John Paul Getty, one of the most famous North American industrialists of, what would that be, the 20th century. And J.P. Getty once said, if you owe the bank $100, that's your problem, which is to say you're going to have to pay that back. But if you owe the bank $100 million, that's the bank's problem, which is to say you have power over the bank, and then you can renegotiate the terms of that relationship. Corporations do it all the time. Extraordinarily wealthy people do it all the time, right? Donald Trump is famously known as the bankruptcy king and brags frequently about how he has used debt so strategically. But the question now is, how can household debtors do the same? How can we understand our collective student debt, our collective carceral debts, our collective medical debts, our collective housing debts, actually as a form of collective power to retake leverage over these systems that need to be democratized, which is to say how we access education, how we access healthcare, how we access housing.
So from your experience with the debt collective, did you witness kind of firsthand how people's attitudes towards debt changed?
Yeah, that's such a good question. We are, as an activist organization, as an organization that tries to organize people, one of the businesses we are in is political education, right? So what does it mean? How can we all change our understanding of what debt is, of what money is, and perhaps most importantly, what it can do, especially once we've completely reoriented our understanding of it? And I would say that work is constant. I mean, we're running a book club right now, an online free book club on our book, Can't Pay, Won't Pay, the case for economic disobedience and debt abolition. So we're running a book club, right? That's an element of political education. We run new member calls. We have branches. We run a political education series. We run something called the Jubilee School. We do debtors assemblies, right? Where we come out to one another about the debts that we carry in an effort to try to shift our understanding of them from isolation, shame, the idea that we are kind of financially irresponsible or illiterate somehow, to a systemic understanding of what does it actually mean that all of us are so deeply in debt for the basic things we need to survive and thrive in life. So that effort, that work to change all of our orientations toward money and toward debt is something that we do at the Debt Collective constantly. It's never a project that's finished. And I will say, to end this particular answer, that I think I learned a tremendous amount about this from modern monetary theory folks, right? I mean, modern monetary theory really uses kind of social movement approaches to really try to change people's minds. And you know better than anybody what an ongoing battle that is. And especially once you start to make some progress, then they're going to debate you in the mainstream press, and all of these other people are going to come out, right? They get frightened, and you have the kind of reaction. So that's just, it's constant work.
When we talk about solving inequality by, for example, cancelling debt, or having government-funded free education or reparations or a Green New Deal, people who use the conventional government is like a household framework for understanding how the government spending works. They could say, oh, so you want me to pay for these things with my taxes? So for ourselves and for other MMT advocates, I think we think that a correct understanding of how governments spend can help people sort of get to grips with the fact that it's not how the government funds itself. That's not how people's tax money is being used, but the mechanics of it are a little bit technical and it's not an easy sell. And I just wondered, as an educator and an organizer, if you had any advice or any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's such an important point. So as an educator, I have found Stephanie Kelton's recently published book very useful. I don't teach in an econ department, and I do teach economic anthropology. But what I like about Stephanie Kelton's book is that it is an econ book, but it is written on a popular press, what we call a trade press here in the US. And she wrote it in language that is extraordinarily accessible. And in fact, we've had Dr. Kelton speak here at UCLA a couple times, and I find her lectures to be effective in the same way. So often, not only do I find myself assigning Professor Kelton's book, which I do every year, but I also use, maybe at this point somewhat verbatim, some of her examples to make the precise point that you just made, Patricia. So for example, I will often say, and now that we're looking at this sort of horrific war between the Ukraine and Russia, let alone the horrific US-led wars in Yemen and Syria and Eritrea and all of these things, right? When the US government, this is a Stephanie Kelton example, when the US government, which is kind of infamously partisan, right? Everybody's like, oh, Congress is dysfunctional and the two parties can't agree on anything. Well, of course, famously, One thing they can agree on is giving the military industrial complex essentially unlimited resources. And so Kelton always says, okay, she gives a certain year. I forget what year it was, 2019. 2019, the Pentagon said, hey, we want our annual budget to be $219 billion or whatever it was. And these two sides of Congress, right, the Democrats and the Republicans say, no problem. We'll actually give you $250 billion, even though you didn't ask for it, because we agree that you are the most important thing on the planet, right? So what do? They simply credit the bank account of the Pentagon, right? The Federal Reserve, the bank of the U.S. federal government, credits the bank account of the Pentagon with $250 billion. Where was the hand-wringing in the press about, we're going to have to raise your taxes? Where was the hand-wringing in the press about, which program are we going to make smaller so that we can make the military-industrial complex bigger? Nowhere, because that's not how it works, right? It actually works. A budget, as MMT people say, as anthropologists say, is a statement of values. The value, the bipartisan value shared across our government is give the military as much as they possibly want and add some more on top just because that's so important to us, right? We never have to have taxes raised. We never have to be threatened with other programs being cut. But then when you get to fully funding higher education, when you get to fully funding medical care, when you get to funding the Green New Deal, suddenly it's like the scarcity model and the false idea that the government's budget works like a household. But all you have to do is look at the military budget to realize that that's not true and realize that it is up to us on the ground as educators and as organizers to create the political will, to build the power to fully fund higher education, to fully fund medical care, to fully fund housing or the Green New Deal. So I think it's an incredibly important point. I use Stephanie Kelton's work on it all the time, and I use that particular example, which I think really resonates with a lot of people.
So a few days ago, the New York Times wrote an opinion about student debt, which for our purposes was kind of a convenient list of bad faith talking points against debt cancellation all in one place. And the Debt Collective put out an annotated response to it. And I don't know if you wrote it.
I didn't write it, which is really awesome. The Debt Collective is full of excellent organizers and thinkers and members. And so we have a lot of people producing content for the Debt Collective. But for your listeners, I would say, if you're not familiar with Medium, if you just go to medium.com and you put in Debt Collective, you'll be able to find our Medium account. And it's a very new account. It's a new genre for us. And there are two articles up there. One is our annotated version of the New York Times op-ed, as you say, which has now been viewed nearly 11,000 times. And honestly, it's really because the New York Times opinion piece was just so bad. I don't think it's that our annotations are so good. They're just sort of obvious. But, I think without kind of going into it detail by detail, though I would encourage folks to read it because it's funny. I think Braxton Brewington, our press secretary, who we often call the shadow secretary of education because he's just so fabulous. I think Braxton annotated it and he's funny. But one thing that I would point out is the New York Times, which, in the United States and elsewhere is largely understood as, I would say, centrist, but like centrist to liberal, right? It's not progressive by any stretch of the imagination, and it's often centrist, but it's a kind of centrist to liberal publication. Their arguments were in such bad faith that the citation that they repeatedly use, which is to say the expert on whom they repeatedly rely, is Betsy DeVos. Betsy DeVos was the Secretary of Education under Donald Trump, and she is, I hate to say it, but she is like a pretty evil person. I mean, she is kind of the czar of the for-profit college model. She ran all these shell corporations as charities and claimed they were charities and bought yachts. I mean, like the worst of the worst. And yet the New York Times nominally, or according to some people, purportedly liberal, cites Betsy DeVos. And why is that? Because they actually can't find meaningful academic citations, meaningful think tank citations on the arguments they were trying to make. I mean, it's kind of one of those moments where You know you're winning when, you know the elite feel threatened when the New York Times editorial board is driven to write such a bad op-ed. I mean, it was really, not that they often write bad op-eds, but this one was really shocking.
They outdid themselves this time.
Thank you. Exactly. They outdid themselves.
So just to be clear, Joe Biden can cancel student debt with a stroke of a pen with an executive order, and nobody can get in the way of that.
That's absolutely right. So Joe Biden, and in fact, any president, has the power of what's called compromise and settlement. The power to compromise and settle certain debts. It is explicitly granted to him in the rule framework of the Department of Education, the Higher Education Act. And we, in fact, if you go to the Debt Collective website, debtcollective.org, or if you look up Debt Collective flick of a pen, with the movement lawyers with whom we work, we even drafted that executive order for him. You can see precisely the legal language he would need, precisely the precedents he would need to set to simply cancel this debt. He does not need to do it through Congress, which we know would go nowhere, right? He has the executive order to do it, and we have written the executive order for him. That is actually not a humorous document. That's quite a serious and even kind of legally viable document. It's only 2 pages. It's not overwhelming. I would really encourage folks to use it. And we've seen precedents for this. It was none other than former President Donald Trump who unilaterally paused student debt payments owed to the federal government. With what power did he do that, right? We can see already that presidents have these kinds of executive powers and can act on them. And Joe Biden is no different. He could do it tomorrow. He could cancel all $1.8 trillion of student debt, quite literally, with the flick of a pen tomorrow.
To me, this is where MMT comes in. The New York Times wrote, quote, "The moratorium on payment of federal loans has already cost $100 billion. And that's their word, cost. How do you respond to a talking point like that?
So the moratorium has not cost the federal government anything because the federal government already spent this money, right? They didn't tax the money first in order to get it, in order to spend it. Anytime they make a loan, right, they are effectively spending that money into the economy. And so we know that that money is already out the door. Folks have used it to attend college. And if they simply zero out that line item in the budget, it will be gone.
Another argument that is often used about this, and actually I've seen it quite recently on Twitter particularly, about this idea that if you were to cancel the student debt, then this would constitute or equate to a large injection of funds into the economy, and therefore potentially causing even more inflation. I find it really difficult in my head to square that because I don't know how to predict how people may spend their monies, but I wonder what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question in terms of, would this spur inflation? Inflation has been really severe the last couple months. It has not been severe the last 2 years. And yet, this payment moratorium has been on for the last 2 years. And when we poll Debt Collective members about how they've been spending the money that they otherwise would have spent on their student debts, most of them are saying, oh, well, now I don't have to go into debt for my rent every year. Or now I'm able to buy the groceries that I need. Or now I'm able to pay down this other bill for my mom for her chemo, right? So it's not like there's a kind of straw man consumer going out and buying these high-end goods, right? As if suddenly they become wealthy because they don't have to pay their $200, $500, $800 student debt payment every month. But on the contrary, in fact, one of our core organizers, Fred Bell, his family lives in New Orleans, and there was a hurricane that they had to flee from during the COVID time. And he was like, it was really wonderful to have $350 a month, around slightly more, so that I could actually help my family evacuate, so that I could actually help my grandmother pay some of her medical bills. So we're not looking at inflationary drivers of people consuming all of these new consumer goods that they wouldn't otherwise buy. What we're looking at is people paying down other debts and people supporting their family members.
Yeah, and I'm always very mistrusting of any kind of measures against inflation, which are sort of based on the active impoverishing of people, this idea that we have to keep people poor, otherwise inflation is going to get crazy for me, right?
So, okay, you're worried about inflation? Tax the rich. No problem. If you're really that concerned, tax the rich, or put caps on these corporations that are saying, oh, well, there are consumers out there, wealthier consumers out there, who are willing to pay some exorbitant price for X commodity. Great. put a cap on the price of that commodity, tax the rich. I have no problem with that. But exactly as you say, to make the argument that the kind of working class people, the middle class people, the poor people who are suffering under this system should be the ones on whose back these arguments about inflation ride? Absolutely not.
Or on the absence of that, here during the war, we had a system where instead of taxing people in order to keep prices down during World War II, what they did was simply postpone those payments until after the war. I know we're in a war, it's a bit distant at the moment from here, but it's sort of similar conditions. Then we can say if it's really that critical, then let's do the same, and say, okay, everybody is kind of enforcing saving until there's plentiful wheat again, or there's plentiful energy again. And do it that way instead of simply just burdening a proportion of the population with a ton of debt.
Absolutely. And I will actually say the other post on Medium, there are only 2 Debt Collective posts on Medium, and the other one is kind of answers or talking points to frequently asked questions. And this question is on there. Won't debt cancellation drive up inflation? And there's a bunch of citations on there that there are estimates, and there's scholarship out there on this, there's science out there on this, that the full year of student debt pause has added 0.2 percentage points to inflation. And the White House actually makes an estimate that's even lower. So 0.2 of the 8.5 inflation that the US saw in March, just a couple months ago, right? And then it talks later about exactly what we're talking about now. So why is it that we should push low income people? Why is it that we should push Black and brown people in the United States who disproportionately hold student debt? Why is it that we should push women who also disproportionately hold student debt into further financial distress, right? They're already more likely to be struggling to repay these loans. So I would also just direct folks to that Medium article, which has some really effective answers with a lot of scholarly sources, not Betsy DeVos sources, on answers to these questions.
And speaking of that awful opinion, the Times in that opinion seem to have just stated as an unfounded claim that student debt cancellation could hurt the Democrats at the polls, but they don't link to any data to back that up. And I imagine there's a reason for that.
Yes, thank you. Exactly. Why are they linking either to no data or to Betsy DeVos data in very big scare quotes? Precisely because there actually is a tremendous amount of data on this stuff. And in fact, if you go to the Debt Collective's Twitter account, which I think is @StrikeDebt, over the last couple of days, we've been lifting up very recent data that just came out in the last couple of days. I think it came out from the Student Borrower Protection Center. It also may have come out. It wasn't the CFPB. It was maybe the Clinic on Predatory Lending. I forget. But anyways, they released a whole bunch of data that says Republicans and Democrats alike in certain age brackets, more than half, significantly more than half, support canceling student debt, even if they didn't have any. Of course, the numbers are much higher among young Democrats than they are among young Republicans, but even among young Republicans, over half of them support that. So the polling data across the board, let alone in this incredibly messed up electoral system we have where certain states matter more as we come into an election cycle, right? So the data that we have from Georgia, the data that we have from Pennsylvania, the data that we have from what are called swing states shows beyond a shadow of a doubt that not only likely Democratic voters, but voters who wouldn't come to the polls unless Biden took a step on this. And Biden even said, and granted, I know, what is it? What is the cliche? It's like you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. But he said, I will start by canceling $10,000 in debt for everybody. Start, which is to say he himself in his own words said that was the floor. And then he said for graduates of HBCUs, historical Black colleges and universities, that he would cancel all their debt. He said it out of his own mouth. And now that he's so reticent to do it, I mean, it's fine. We're organizers. We understand we have to build power to make people in power do things, right? We understand that that's our job. But it really is just shocking that the Democratic Party seems willing to shoot themselves in the electoral foot at this moment, which in our country, and certainly beyond, but in our country, we're at a pretty dicey crossroads. And it would be really helpful for the Democratic Party to kind of not only energize their base, but bring in more people with a really popular issue like this.
Why do you think their change in attitude has been? I mean, I'm sure people have a lot of theories, but is it to do with a belief that student debt cancellation position would be non-credible Are they out of touch with the electorate, basically? Or is it that they fear funding will be pulled out from some of their candidates, or a combination of those, perhaps?
It's a really good question, and I don't have any kind of privileged transparency into the issue. One of the things I will say is that, any government apparatus is internally differentiated, right? By which I mean, there are plenty of people in the White House, there are plenty of people in Congress, there are plenty of staffers, there are plenty of aides, all of whom are absolutely behind full student debt cancellation, right? And then some people, of course, like Elizabeth Warren or Chuck Schumer, have taken a position at 50%. And then you have the more kind of progressive caucus who's pushing for 100%. But even within the White House itself, we know that there is a broad diversity of opinions. In terms of what is holding Joe Biden himself back, I can't say. The only thing I would kind of lob into the fray of multiple opinions is that Joe Biden's political career began in the state of Delaware. And the state of Delaware is like the equivalent of the offshore financial center of the United States, right? It was, in fact, Joe Biden as a senator who made student debt not able to be discharged in bankruptcy. Joe Biden is a dear friend of credit card companies. He's a dear friend of corporations who want to come and register in the state of Delaware so that they can take advantage of all kinds of tax loopholes, right? I mean, Joe Biden's financial policy sense is deeply conservative and deeply elitist. And because him alone, was the one who drove this idea that student debts can't be dischargeable in bankruptcy, I think he sees it as a referendum on his own track record. And he's right. It is. He was wrong. And so it's like admitting I was wrong. And I think that's hard for any politician.
So I'll move on from this dreadful New York Times thing in a minute, but they can't seem to push back on debt cancellation with any data on it's politically impossible or it's politically costly. So then they move on to saying that an across-the-board cancellation would be tremendously regressive. Now, would it?
So no, it absolutely wouldn't. And I'll give you a detailed answer to that. But first, I want to point to some evidence, to some data that for folks who actually want to dig into this that I think is the best. So Marshall Steinbaum, a really wonderful economist, published a kind of public-facing account of this in Current Affairs. So Current Affairs, a magazine of cultural and politics. And he published it on June 15th of 2019, a couple of years ago. Is student debt cancellation regressive? No, is the title of the article. And the article cites all of the really wonderful economic and quantitative research on this. But what I would say to your audience today is most rich people don't have student debt, which is to say student debt is already means tested, right? Their parents wrote a check for their tuition. So the vast majority of people with student debt were generally poor, working class, middle class, right? Everybody who doesn't have those tens of thousands of dollars available to pay for tuition. Generally speaking, the poorer you are, the more debt you have to take out to get an education. And because poorer people borrow more money, they also then carry their loans for longer and therefore pay much more interest. And student debt is compounding interest. It's at about 7% from the federal government. And if you can't pay, that 7% is added back, or whatever you didn't pay is added back to the principal amount, which tells us that the very same college degree costs poor people more than it does rich people. And we know this, right? Capitalism for the poor, socialism for the rich. So there's some great sources, again, in that Medium article that shows how student debt is progressive and shows that it's Black women in this country who carry more student debt than anybody else. And that you have to, right, like helping us differentiate. What does it mean to differentiate between income and wealth? And I think the last thing I'll say that I think is a really illustrative story here, a really wonderful politician in this country by the name of Stacey Abrams, who has done some extraordinary political organizing among Black women, in particular in Georgia, and who many people have credited with getting Biden into the White House because of the sheer numbers of Black women she was able to mobilize in Georgia. She herself was running for governor of Georgia several years ago. And she wrote an op-ed in Forbes. And for people who don't know Forbes, it's kind of a magazine of the business class, when she was running for governor of Georgia. And that op-ed, I think the title was something like my $150,000 of student debt shouldn't disqualify me from running for governor. She is obviously an extraordinarily successful woman by any measure, right? She has a JD from Yale Law School. I mean, she was a practicing lawyer and now she's this extraordinarily accomplished politician. And yet she had to tell the story of what it meant to be born into a Black working class family in the South. She was excelling in school, right? She graduates. I forget what her undergraduate degree is from. She has no one to help her pay that tuition as an undergrad, let alone at Yale Law School. And does she get some grants, some need-based grants? Sure, she does. But she also has to pay her housing. She also has to pay for all of those textbooks. She also has to pay for transportation, not only around New Haven, but so that she can go back to the South every once in a while and visit her family. And because she's the successful one in her family, she's also sending money home so that her parents can take care of the grandchildren, right? The intergenerational forms of caregiving that are in her home. So we can't only think about, oh, well, Stacey Abrams is a lawyer and she makes so much money and we shouldn't pay her student debt, right? We actually have to think about intergenerational wealth and how race and racism in this country and far beyond affect intergenerational wealth. So if you're saying to the Black women who now, because of discrimination in this country, many for the first time are accessing not only higher education, but then a law degree or a medical degree, right? Professions that in the United States used to be all white men. And if you're saying to them now, we're not going to help you get out from under this debt to find your way into the middle class, to find your way into the upper class. I mean, it's just the entire argument makes me livid and irate. But for a more balanced response, find our Medium account and check out all the data and the sources that are there.
So moving into the activism then, what does a debt strike look like?
So the provocation of a debt strike is very simple. And it's to say that debtors, isolated, right, one by one, we are vulnerable, we are marginalized, and the creditor, whoever the creditor may be, has a tremendous amount of power over us, right? But together, think of that $1.8 trillion of outstanding student debt. Together, we can leverage a tremendous amount of power, right? If we think of that J.P. Getty quote again, we own the bank. In this case, we own the federal government, right? We have a tremendous amount of power leveraged collectively together. So the provocation of a student debt strike is simply, what does it look like if debtors organize and collectively don't pay in order to make a demand? Now, what is the demand? The demand might be the cancellation of the debt. The demand might be a write down of the debt. The demand might be that the federal government should, in fact, resource something, and that something shouldn't be individually debt financed, right? Like medical care or like student debt. The demand might be simple. It might be for a lower interest rate. It could be all kinds of things. But the idea of a debt strike is that debt itself is leverage, right? Tremendously wealthy people understand that. Corporations understand that. The idea of a debt strike is to say that household debtors, once we come to understand that, can use a strike or the credible threat of a strike, right? Just like a labor strike, to exact demands from creditors. So that's the easy answer, and that is an answer I believe in. But then here's the organizing answer. It is obviously much more difficult in practice. Debtors do not share factory floors, right? We don't come into work every day and we can't go to the church afterward or go have a beer at the bar afterward and talk about a potential strike. We are geographically dispersed in place. We are unified not by an employer, but we are unified by a creditor. So that's one barrier. Another barrier, of course, and this is less of a barrier than just something we have to think about as organizers. Even if you're in a labor union, it's not like you join a labor union and you go on a strike the next day, right? Strikes are risky. You have to do stress tests. Ideally, you want to strike funds so that if there are any consequences for people going on strike, you're able to resource those people to meet their needs, right? The same thing is true of a debtors union. There are all kinds of tactics and strategies at our disposal long before we ever get to an actual debt strike. So the organizing of it is tremendous work and takes years. And if you're interested in it, I'm happy to talk more about the nation's first student debt strike, which was with folks who held debts from for-profit colleges and how that worked and how we built toward that moment and what we did to kind of understand differentiated risk and move forward collectively.
Yes, please tell us about that. Is that the Corinthian 15?
Yes, the Corinthian 15. So, rightly, one thing people are always concerned about are the risks of a debt strike. right? And it depends what kind of debt it is and how it's regulated. And we can get into the nitty gritty of that if you want. But in short, let's say for student debt, which is what so many people are paying attention to now, the risks are tremendous, especially because the federal government is the creditor, right? They have a tremendous amount of power. They can garnish your wages. They can garnish your Social Security. They can garnish your tax return. They can make you ineligible for all kinds of public benefits. And then, of course, your credit score will tank, right? I mean, the talons of financialization are very deep into us. So when we started organizing with folks who held debts from for-profit colleges, obviously we're thinking very deeply about these potential consequences and how they fall unevenly on people, right? Some of us may have more financial stability than others and therefore be able to have a kind of larger risk appetite. And we have to be really mindful of folks for whom those consequences would be dire, would render them homeless, for example. So one of the things that we realized as we started working with the Corinthian debtors is that they already weren't paying and they were suffering those consequences alone. They were having their wages garnished individually. They were having their tax returns garnished individually, which is to say they were already suffering the worst consequences and they were suffering them alone. So one of our intentions in that strike was to turn that I can't pay and I'm suffering alone into I won't pay. And I am asserting it collectively as a political demand, right? As a collective demand. So that's why we titled our book, Can't Pay, Won't Pay, The Case for Economic Disobedience and Debt Abolition. Because of course, if you are suffering those consequences in a collective, you have more social resources, you have more economic resources, you have more media resources to tell your story and to switch the morality of debt and to say that for-profit colleges in particular, I mean, it's like a subprime education, right? They were intentionally targeting veterans. They were intentionally targeting single mothers. They were intentionally targeting migrant communities, African-American communities, just to get their asses in classes, right? It was actually a relatively easy moral argument to make. Now, that said, what about all those people who wanted to join the campaign, who wanted to build power, but were paying a small modicum and weren't ready to run those risks? This is where the multiple tactics come into play. We put a piece of online legal mutual aid up called the Defense to Repayment App. Working with movement lawyers, we'd found a little known provision in the Higher Education Act that said if your school has defrauded you, and most for-profit colleges, if not all, defrauded their students, you have a defense to repayment. But this was some little known provision, buried on page 183 of all of those rules and regulations. We made it into an easy to use app on the computer where you just answer some basic questions about your experience. It populates a legal PDF on the back end, and 70,000 people used that tool. All of them were sent to the Department of Education. And right away, we as a union were invited to a negotiated rulemaking process in Washington, D.C., which is to say that the strike as a tactic works for some people some of the time. And even with the Corinthian 15, we had a legal workshop. We had a story sharing workshop. We had multiple retreats leading up to it, right? There was a tremendous amount of work there. But there was also this legal mutual aid route where folks who were not ready to take that risk, a route that they could go. And it was those two tactics together that brought us so many steps toward where we are today, where we're on the verge of student debt cancellation.
Yes, you talk about the importance of experimenting with different approaches on the Debt Collective website, don't you?
Absolutely. The multiple tactics are so important, and not to fetishize the idea of a strike, but the idea of a strike is useful because it helps us understand the power of debt, right? Which heretofore most household debtors have only experienced as disempowering, as marginalizing, as isolating, right? So the idea of a debt strike, analogous to the idea of a labor strike, I think is incredibly clarifying, but it really is something that we don't get to, right? We have to build power for years before we do something like that and make sure that people are protected from the worst ramifications.
Pessimistic me perhaps looks back at the 2008 crash and sees kind of the widespread non-paying of debt and how easily those people who didn't pay their mortgage were punished by being evicted, whereas the government stood up for the financial entities who lent irresponsibly and actually gave them the cash. Would you fear that something similar would happen?
I love that question. And in fact, in Can't Pay, Won't Pay, we talk about our counterfactual of 2008 with the mortgage holders union and what could have happened if folks in the mortgage holders union alerted their union representatives that their adjustable rate mortgage was about to balloon, right? Or that the assessment on their house had gone down and they were now underwater on their loan, and could have come together, right? And built enough power to refuse and to demand a write down. So we write about that counterfactual. And I hear that pessimism and I am absolutely empathetic to it, which is to say, I lived through that too. But interestingly, the debt collective comes out of that precise moment. It is to say, we learn in that moment. We see the power of debt, in that case, the mortgage market, to dispossess, in this country, disproportionately Latinx families, Black families. We see the power of debt to dispossess. What does it mean to think about the power of debt to bring collective power? That is the provocation we have organized around. So rather than kind of like looking back with pessimism, it's like, what does it mean to learn the lesson and then to build new forms of political organizing, new forms of financial organizing from that analysis? And I think you're absolutely right that in the COVID moment, we're in another one of those moments, right? We've seen unprecedented policies, mortgage payment moratoria, rent payment moratoria, student debt payment moratoria, in the name of getting things, quote unquote, back to normal eventually. And we've seen the same thing, right? Corporations are given PPP loans and then they're bailed out completely. And yet somehow you can't bail out the student debtors. And so I guess it is to say, it is precisely that pessimism that forms the starting point of our organizing, and then using that analysis to say, how can we make it otherwise?
There's so much more to talk about, and I hope we get to do this again at some point. But for now, that's a great place to leave it. We've been talking with economic anthropologist and co-founder of the Debt Collective, Professor Hannah Appel. And we'll link to where you can find her work and to where you can get involved with the Debt Collective. And their website is an organizing platform. So we'll link to all of that in the show notes for this episode. But for now, thanks again for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Professor Hannah Appel.
Thanks so much to you, Patricia and Christian. I really enjoyed it, and I'm happy to come back anytime.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.